There are evils that do not scream. They do not need thick darkness, nor do they rely on shock or spectacle. Sometimes, evil moves quietly, gently, passing through a sleeping home, the very place where people believe they are safest. Just a few hours before this footage was recorded, Melissa Oxley was an ordinary wife, a gentle stepmother, living in a small house with her husband and a 6-year-old little girl. A family built not by blood, but by choice, by love, and by the belief that past pain had finally been left behind. But in the early morning hours of the 21st of February 2008, everything collapsed. A husband lay motionless in his bed, a single shotgun blast ending his life while he slept. Beside him was Melissa, covered in blood, yet without a single injury. She said she heard nothing, saw nothing, knew nothing about what had happened. Police looked at her. The public looked at her, the wife sleeping next to the victim, the beneficiary of the insurance, the only adult left alive in the room. All eyes turned to Melissa. But in the room next door, there was a 6-year-old child who was not asleep. And in that quiet, horrifying moment, those innocent eyes saw something that adults would only dare to believe much later. Before the tragedy, their life looked like something quietly beautiful. Not perfect in a flashy way, but warm, steady, and filled with intention. Melissa Oxley did not enter that home to replace anyone. She walked into Ben Oxley's life knowing he was already a father, carrying the weight of a broken marriage and the fierce love he had for his young daughter, Alyssa. Melissa understood that loving Ben meant accepting a life where she would never come first, and she chose it anyway. Alyssa was still very young, sensitive, strong-willed, and deeply afraid of losing her father. Like many children shaped by separation, she watched carefully, guarded her heart, and tested boundaries. Melissa did not rush her. She did not demand affection. She allowed trust to grow naturally, in quiet moments, shared meals at a small kitchen table, school drop-offs in the morning, awkward hugs before bedtime that slowly became familiar and safe. Inside that modest home, Ben began to see something he had long hoped for but never truly believed he would have again. A family. A woman who loved his daughter not out of obligation, but by choice. A little girl who laughed more, slept more peacefully, and no longer tensed when the word mother was spoken. Their wedding day was more than a ceremony. It was a promise. On that very day, Melissa signed the papers to legally adopt Alyssa. No pressure, no hesitation, just a clear decision made from the heart. From that moment on, Alyssa was no longer the child that came with the marriage. She was Melissa's daughter, not just on paper, but in every daily act of care, patience, and love. A family formed, not by blood, but by commitment strong enough to stay. None of them knew that this fragile happiness was already moving toward an ending, that the home filled with soft routines and quiet joy would soon become the place where everything they built would be torn apart. After the divorce, Ben Oxley did not fall apart. He narrowed his world until only one thing truly mattered: his daughter. When the marriage ended, Ben chose a quieter life. There were no late nights, no chasing distractions, no attempts to escape the weight of loss. Every decision he made was filtered through a single question: is this good for Alyssa? He fought for shared custody and then shaped his entire routine around her. Morning breakfasts, school drop-offs, evenings spent together instead of apart. Wherever Ben went, Alyssa went with him, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Being her father was not a role he performed, it was who he was. Their bond was visible to everyone around them. Alyssa trusted her father completely. She talked to him without fear, without holding back. And Ben listened, the way only a parent truly present can listen. Not half distracted, not impatient. He saw his daughter, fully. There were small traditions that meant everything. Dancing together at a Valentine's Day event, to their favorite song, Butterfly Kisses, quiet moments in the car, her head resting against the window while Ben glanced over just to make sure she was still there. Simple memories, ordinary to the outside world, but sacred to them. Friends and family described Ben as driven, but not by ambition or success. He was driven by responsibility, by the need to be better, more stable, more patient. Because his daughter was watching, Alyssa was his priority, his anchor, his reason to wake up and keep going. To Alyssa, her father was safety. He was joy. He was the person who showed up every single time. And in a world that had already taken one version of family away from her, Ben was the proof that some people do not leave. None of them could have imagined that this deep, unbreakable bond would be the very thing that made what came next so devastating. That the man who built his entire life around protecting his child would one day be taken from her, while she was still too young to understand why. When Melissa entered Ben Oxley's life, she stepped into a space that was already full. A man healing from divorce, and a little girl who loved her father fiercely and was not ready to share him with anyone. From the very beginning, Alyssa made her feelings clear. On their first meeting, she watched closely, protective and wary. Her jealousy was not rude. It was the quiet fear of a child who had already lost too much. "Do not take him away from me," was what her silence seemed to say. Melissa noticed it immediately. And instead of feeling rejected, she understood. She did not compete for Ben's attention. She did not demand affection from Alyssa. She gave the child space, patience, and time. She allowed love to grow at its own pace, without forcing it into a shape it was not ready for. Slowly, trust appeared in small, unremarkable moments. A shared laugh, a bedtime routine, the comfort of knowing that this woman was not trying to replace anyone, only to stay. Over time, Alyssa lowered her guard, and Melissa became something gentle and familiar in her world. As Ben and Melissa grew closer, the three of them began to resemble a family. Not suddenly, not perfectly, but honestly. By the time their wedding day arrived, Alyssa was no longer on the outside. She was at the center, walking as the flower girl, holding a role that meant she belonged. During the ceremony, Melissa knelt down in front of Alyssa. She placed a bracelet on the little girl's wrist, engraved with a promise. A promise that went beyond marriage, that she would love Alyssa as her own, and always be there, no matter what. It was not a grand declaration. It was a quiet vow, made at a child's level, spoken with intention. And in that moment, Melissa did not just marry Ben. She chose a child and became a mother by choice. Bound, not by blood, but by commitment strong enough to last. The 21st of February 2008 began like any other night. Quiet. Ordinary. Nothing to warn the people inside that this would be the last time their family would exist in the same way. The house settled into sleep. Ben lay beside Melissa, unaware that he would never wake up again. In the darkness, a single shotgun blast shattered the silence. Loud enough to end a life. Quiet enough, somehow, to leave the house frozen in disbelief. When the sound faded, there was blood, there was stillness, and there were no screams. Melissa said she heard nothing. That she woke up covered in blood, unable to explain how it happened. Her husband was gone. The man who had built his life around his child was lying lifeless in bed. In the next room, Alyssa was awake. She had heard the noise. She had felt the house change. Confused and frightened, the 6-year-old got out of bed and walked toward her father's room. What she saw there would follow her for the rest of her life. Moments later, the 911 call came in. Melissa's voice on the line, strained, emotional, asking for help, saying her husband had been shot, saying she did not know why, did not know how. But in the background of that call was something even more haunting. Alyssa's cries. A child calling out for her father. "Daddy! Daddy! Wake up!" That sound was not panic. It was disbelief. The kind only a child feels when the person who always shows up suddenly does not move. Police arrived to a house filled with blood and silence. A woman alive, a man dead, and a little girl whose world had ended in the middle of the night, still calling for a father who would never answer again. When investigators stepped into the house, the story it told did not match the chaos of the night. There were no broken locks, No shattered windows. No signs of a stranger forcing their way inside. The doors were closed. The house remained exactly as a family had left it before going to sleep. Ben Oxley had been killed in his own bed. The shotgun blast came from close range. There was no struggle. No defensive wounds. No evidence that he ever woke up. Whoever fired the weapon was already inside the home, already close enough to pull the trigger without resistance. That reality narrowed the focus immediately. Detectives began with the obvious. Who had access to the house? Who knew the layout? Who could move through it in the dark without being noticed? And at first, suspicion briefly fell on Craig, Alyssa's biological mother. Craig had a complicated past with Ben. Custody disputes, lingering resentment. The kind of unresolved tension that often draws attention after a tragedy. Investigators questioned whether anger or jealousy could have followed Ben home that night, but the evidence did not support it. Craig had a solid alibi. Phone records, witnesses, and timelines placed her far from the house when the gun was fired. She had no access to the weapon, no reason to be in the home, and no physical trace linking her to the crime scene. One by one, the suspicion faded. With no signs of forced entry and no outside suspect left standing, detectives were forced to look inward. Back to the bedroom. Back to the person lying alive beside Ben. The crime scene was quiet, but it was not unclear. It was a locked house. A single, fatal shot. A man who never stood a chance. And the truth was narrowing, even as the weight of it grew heavier for everyone involved. As the investigation moved forward, Melissa Oxley was no longer just a grieving wife. She became a suspect. The facts were difficult to ignore. She was the only adult in the house when Ben was killed. She had been lying beside him when the gun was fired. There were no signs of an intruder, no evidence of anyone else entering or leaving that night. And slowly, the questions turned into accusations. Then came the insurance policy. $400,000 in life insurance, with Melissa listed as the beneficiary. To investigators, it looked like motive. To the town, it looked like something darker. Money has a way of changing how grief is perceived. And suddenly, every tear was measured, every word dissected. In a small town, suspicion spreads faster than truth. People who once smiled at Melissa now watched her closely. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. Eyes followed her at the grocery store, at church, at school events. She did not have to be charged to feel judged. The verdict was already forming in whispers. Melissa insisted on her innocence. She said she loved Ben, that she would never hurt him, that she had no memory of the shooting, only waking to blood and horror. But her explanation sounded impossible to many. How does someone sleep through a gunshot? How does a wife survive while her husband does not? Grief, once private, became a performance she could never get right. If she cried, people said it was an act. If she stayed quiet, they said she was cold. There was no version of pain that felt acceptable. And somewhere in the middle of it all was a 6-year-old girl, watching adults argue about money and murder, while the man who made her feel safe was gone forever. As the town turned its gaze on Melissa, the family that once seemed whole was fully broken. Not only by death, but by doubt. After Ben's death, the loss did not stop at grief. It continued, quietly and relentlessly, into separation. Authorities decided that Alyssa could no longer remain with Melissa. The woman who had tucked her in at night, packed her lunches, promised to stay forever, was suddenly removed from her life, not because Melissa had been charged, not because she had been proven guilty, but because suspicion was enough. For Alyssa, it felt like losing her family all over again. She had already lost her father in the most violent and confusing way imaginable. Now she was being taken from the only maternal figure she knew as home. There were no gentle explanations that made sense to a child. Only adults saying this is for your safety. While her world continued to disappear, the pain was doubled. One loss stacked on top of another. A child mourning a father, while being separated from a mother she still loved. And through it all, Alyssa remained firm in one belief. She trusted Melissa. She told social workers, investigators, anyone who would listen. Melissa would not hurt my dad. She said it with the certainty only a child can have. Not based on logic or evidence, but on lived experience. On bedtime stories. On promises kept. On years of quiet care that do not suddenly vanish overnight. While adults debated motive and money, Alyssa held on to memory. She remembered who comforted her when she cried. Who showed up every day. Who chose to be her mother without being asked. Being taken away did not make her doubt Melissa. It only deepened her confusion and grief. To Alyssa, the separation felt like punishment for loving the wrong person. Like being asked to rewrite her own heart. In a system focused on suspicion and procedure, a child's voice became small. But that voice never changed. Even as her life was rearranged by adults, Alyssa continued to believe in the woman she still called Mom. At first, investigators did not know what to do with Alyssa's words. She was 6 years old, small, traumatized, and awake when adults insisted she must have been asleep. But Alyssa kept repeating the same thing. She was not sleeping that night. She spoke about the house in the moments before the gunshot, the quiet. Then the sound of a door. Not slammed. Opened slowly. Carefully. As if someone was trying not to be noticed. Alyssa described footsteps in the hallway. Soft, familiar. Not the steps of a stranger running, but of someone who knew where they were going. Someone who belonged there. From her bed, she saw a shape pass her doorway. A shadow moving toward her father's room. She said the figure did not turn on the lights. Did not speak. Just moved with purpose through the darkness. After the noise, after the silence, Alyssa said she went to look for her father. She remembered standing in the doorway of the bedroom, frozen. She remembered blood. She remembered her father not moving. For a long time, adults tried to explain her story away. They called it imagination, a dream, trauma filling in the blanks. But Alyssa did not change her account. Not over days, not over months, not over years. She was the child who did not sleep. The witness no one wanted to rely on. Yet she described details that were disturbingly precise for a nightmare. The door. The shadow. The stillness afterward. In a case filled with silence, Alyssa's memory was the loudest thing left behind. And the question no one could escape was simple and devastating. If the child was awake, and she saw someone move through the house, then the truth had been standing in the room all along. The truth did not arrive all at once. It crept forward, piece by piece, carried not by confession, but by persistence. Years after Ben Oxley's death, investigators began to look beyond the walls of the house. Beyond Melissa. Beyond the assumptions that had once felt so certain. And that is when two names slowly came into focus. Dawn and James. Dawn had history. History with anger, with resentment that never healed. She believed Ben had wronged her, taken something from her life that could not be replaced. Over time, bitterness hardened into something colder, something dangerous. James followed that bitterness. Whether driven by loyalty, manipulation, or his own hunger for money, he became part of a plan that should never have existed. Together, they shared something powerful and destructive. Hatred mixed with the promise of financial gain. The insurance policy, once used to point blame at Melissa, became clearer in a different light. Money was not just a coincidence. It was a motive. A reason strong enough to turn anger into action. Phone records, timelines, testimony. Slowly, the story aligned with what Alyssa had said all along. A familiar presence. Someone who knew the house. Someone who could move quietly through the dark without fear. The pieces finally fit together in a way that no longer required excuses. Dawn and James were arrested. The illusion shattered. What had once been painted as a sleeping wife beside a murdered husband was revealed for what it truly was. A calculated act, carried out by people driven by resentment and greed. For Melissa, the truth came too late to undo the damage. Years of suspicion. Years of isolation. Years stolen by doubt. And for Alyssa, it was both justice and heartbreak. She had told the truth when no one wanted to hear it. She had carried that night inside her for years, waiting for adults to catch up to what a child already knew. In the end, it was not evil hiding in the shadows. It was hatred, nurtured in daylight, and money that made people believe they were entitled to take a life. The courtroom was quiet in a way that felt heavy, not peaceful. Heavy with years of waiting, pain, and unanswered questions finally coming to an end. James sat at the defendant's table as the verdict was read. Guilty. The words landed without drama, but with finality. Life in prison. No possibility of escape from what he had done. For the law, this was justice. A sentence measured in decades, meant to match the weight of a life taken while a man slept. Around the room, there were no cheers, no relief that felt complete. Only the quiet release of breath from people who had carried this case far longer than they wanted to. Melissa listened from the gallery, her face still. Years of suspicion had hollowed her trust in public spaces like this one. Even now, with the truth exposed, the damage could not be fully undone. Justice had arrived, but it had arrived late. Then Alyssa spoke. No longer the 6-year-old who cried for her father in the night. She stood older, steadier, yet still carrying that child inside her. She looked toward the man who had taken her father away and said words no one expected. She forgave him. It was not forgiveness that erased the crime. It was forgiveness born from survival. From years of anger that weighed too much on a heart that had already broken once, Alyssa chose not to carry hatred into the rest of her life. In that moment, the courtroom shifted. Justice had done its part. And now, something quieter and more powerful took place. A child who had lost everything refused to let the worst night of her life define who she would become. James would leave the courtroom in chains. Alyssa would leave carrying a choice. Not to forget, not to excuse, but to let go and step forward without becoming a prisoner of the past. In the end, there was no celebration, only quiet returns. After the truth was finally spoken aloud in court, Melissa and Alyssa were allowed back into each other's lives. Not as suspects or witnesses, but as mother and daughter who had lost years to silence and doubt. Their reunion was not dramatic, no tears for an audience, just an embrace that lasted a few seconds longer than necessary, as if both were afraid the world might separate them again. They had grown older in different ways. Melissa carried the weight of years spent proving her innocence instead of living her grief. Alyssa carried memories no child should have, learned too early what violence and absence feel like. What connected them was not the past, but the decision to stay. This was never a family built by blood alone. It was built by choice, by promises made at a child's height, by love that survived suspicion, separation, and time. What had been taken from them could never be replaced. Ben would always be missing. The space he filled would always remain quiet. Yet, life continued, gently. In routines, in shared meals, in conversations that did not always need words. Melissa did not try to be perfect. Alyssa did not need her to be. They simply showed up for each other, again and again. The echo of that night never fully disappeared. Some sounds never do. But it softened. With truth. With forgiveness. With the understanding that evil does not always announce itself, and that love does not always break under pressure. This story was never about monsters in the dark. It was about people, flawed, hurting, choosing, in the aftermath of unthinkable loss, to remain human.